Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome now to the third edition of our new webinar series, which is all focused on winning e-com strategies. If you're joining then for the first time, it's great to have you along. It's probably just worth doing a very quick recap, I think, of the last webinars that we've done. So the first one we did was with our partner Scurry. And we were talking about leveraging data to better optimize your delivery proposition. Most recently, we were also on with Segmentify, and we talked about the evolution of personalization and how it's being adopted nowadays. And today, I'm pleased to be joined by Adyen's own Colin Neal over at the Manchester office. And we'll be talking about understanding European payment methods and VAT for cross-border e-commerce. So Colin, thanks for coming.
No, thanks, Declan, and hi everyone. It's really nice to be able to kind of have this opportunity to meet you. Just a little bit of background. So my name is Colin Neal. I look after the kind of northern division for Adyen. Payments is quite a new thing for me, I guess. For a number of years, I was the retail ops director for Burberry. So I'm kind of quite familiar with a lot of the challenges that you guys face and see today. And it's a pleasure to talk to you.
Great, thanks for that, Colin. So I think what's great about this particular subject from our point of view is that everything we do at Kumo, we try to put a bit of a focus on internationalization, global expansion, particularly for our retailers. And I think this subject here, looking at localized payment methods, really starts to delve into that. So first of all, then what we'll do is we'll go through a very quick run through of the agenda for this afternoon. So what we always like to highlight first and foremost is some of the biggest challenges we know that are out there for merchants, again, really thinking about that globalization piece. And then we'll go quite into some detail, quite granular in terms of those payment methods that we're seeing being adopted across Europe and how certain cultural nuances dictate which payment methods are used in which markets. We'll also look at some of the best practices again for your online store, again, really focusing on the checkout experience there. We're going to touch on some of the VAT and invoicing regulations, talking about some of the payment fraud prevention aspects that are going on right now. I think there's definitely a lot of buzz about this, and I think Colin has some great insight into that, which we'll get to towards the end of the webinar. And then, as we like to do at the end, we talk about some of the key takeaways just to summarise our thoughts and findings. And in terms of the Q&A session at the end, so for those of you that want to get involved, want to start asking some questions in advance or during the webinar, and we can get to that at the end, feel free to use the panel on the GoToWebinar link. All right, so if we dive in then. So to set the scene, I suppose, just to look at where the landscape is at the moment, this I think is quite a relevant and important stat then. So in 2018, 36% of online shoppers made purchases from sellers in other EU countries compared to with 26% in 2013. So really what we're seeing there is a shift from about 1/4 of all consumers up to now what is 1/3 from 2013 to 2018. And I think from my point of view, there's kind of two key driving forces behind this. I think the first one just being that there is just an organic push from a lot of merchants to try and leverage the fact that there's obviously huge markets that surround their domestic market. And I think organically, I think as customers, we're becoming more accepting of purchasing from a retailer that we know is outside of our home country, knowing things like delivery is becoming a lot more reliable, it's becoming a lot more cheaper if you're shipping internationally, I think is just changing the consumer mindset. But there's also another point to this, which is that a lot of this is actually happening without consumers being fully aware of it. So when you find that a retailer is executing on a true localized experience, a consumer actually isn't during that process aware that or might not be aware that they're purchasing from a retailer away from their home market. So that's a couple of interesting points I think about that stat there. And some of the, I guess, the broader overarching issues and challenges then when we talk about internationalization. So there's various, to be honest, that we come up against. So everything from having to manage multiple storefronts or multiple product databases, multiple back-end instances. A lot of that is a bit of a stress on back office operations, trying to get multiple languages right. So obviously trying to tap into each individual market and the cultural differences. It's very difficult sometimes to get the product descriptions and content pages, really hone in on the market you're targeting and try and get them appropriate for the audience. So we know there's challenges there, and trying to deliver in the multiple currencies in itself, trying to use the actual mechanisms and technology to deliver that is a challenge. There's various VAT and tax regulations, certain intricacies across Europe that is something that we all have to spend time understanding. Certain regions and industries of the world, you'll see that there is geo-blocking and payment fraud prevention, which I think we're going to dive into a little bit more later, which I think is quite interesting considering the timing. And naturally, there's always shipping and customs challenges there when you're trying to do something on an international scale. So that's it from a broad sense. But what's interesting is that there is one particular challenge that we find to be quite unique. So this summary statement, I think, summarizes it quite nicely. Retailers that expand into overseas markets often suffer from low conversion rates when there are gaps in delivering a localized experience to customers. But the most significant gap we're seeing is a lack of relevant payment methods. And I suppose the reason that we're here today and why we've got Colin on and using his experience is because we want to understand why that is. Why is there such a gap there, and why is it an ongoing challenge, and what's changed now in recent years?
So it's a really interesting question, right? And I guess from my own personal experience was when I was a retailer, kind of sitting in the same position as a lot of guys on the call today. For me, it was one way, I didn't really know where to start, and then technically, what did that mean for the business? And I guess now that I'm here and I'm working at Adyen, and I'm lucky enough to talk to lots of different retailers who face lots of different challenges. I see two things. I think two things really matter. So for me, the first reason there's a gap is that there's just a lack of awareness. So if you're looking to expand internationally and kind of grow your fascias internationally, then actually, where do you go? So who is it you talk to? Who is it you ask? How do you learn and understand what those payment methods need to be? Which ones do you know the relevant ones to switch on that are going to drive you significant volume of traffic? And if you do switch those on, what do they need to look like? How do they need to present to the customer? And how do they impact kind of the customer journey? So that is a significant challenge, I think, in terms of kind of trying to understand what that really means. So what I thought it'd be quite nice to do today is just give you a couple of examples. Hopefully none of this is new to anybody on the call. But what I thought it would be to just be nice and kind of show you, well, if a payment method is so important inside of a country, what can that mean for your conversion? So hopefully we're all looking at kind of the same screen right now. So if we look at the UK as a whole, then there's no surprises there. So what we see is an e-commerce market where Visa, MasterCard predominate the market. So providing you offer those payment methods on your checkout, then you're going to touch the preferred methods of customers inside of the UK. We'll come to things like different ways of interacting with underpinning cards like Apple Pay and Android Pay later, but fundamentally the preferred method of customers inside of the UK is still traditional card-based payment. But if we go to Germany as a comparison, that's absolutely not the same. So what you can see here is that actually domestic German customers are customers located inside of Germany that are making purchases on websites that present inside of Germany, prefer to pay with SOFORT and then set the direct debit. So fundamentally, the main difference there is that what they prefer to do is pay using their bank. There's less trust of Visa and MasterCard, which you can see from the stats, are not the preferred payment methods. And what we see time and time again, and I'll keep repeating this message because it is really important, is that if you don't offer those payment methods, then your conversion drops significantly because customers will abandon a basket because you're not offering the right payment methods that those customers trust and they prefer. Here, if we look at Italy, what you can see in Italy, again, similar to the UK, a much more significant predomination of Visa and MasterCard, but a higher proliferation from PayPal. And PayPal is an interesting one because I think the more we see tokenized saved cards, and the more we see things like Apple Pay as a vehicle to kind of transit that card and simplify the checkout process. PayPal's kind of shares dropping a little, but fundamentally there's not a great deal of difference between Italy and the UK in terms of how customers pay. By stark comparison, if you look at the Netherlands, then the message is pretty clear, is that if you do not offer Ideal as a method of payment on your checkout, then fundamentally you're losing 80% of the population, because 80% of the population prefer to pay with Ideal as their payment method, which means that the risk to your abandonment at checkout is very, very high. And we can have a little bit of fun if we want to. So if we step outside of the EU for a second and we just switch to Brazil, and there's an overarching message here, and obviously it's quite clear to everybody. But a payment method in Brazil, which is incredibly important to offer at the checkout, is something called boleto. And boleto you may never have heard of, and I guess to some degree, to kind of us inside of the EU, it's quite an obscure way of paying, where it's a voucher that is produced on the back of your checkout that you can take to any local convenience store, and you can actually pay in the convenience store against that voucher, and actually your payment's integrated back to your basket at the checkout. So realistically, the overarching message for us that we see a lot is that actually, I guess to answer your question, Declan, is, why is it that we see a gap in payment? Well, yes, we see customers or retailers failing to reach their customers because they don't offer the right payment methods. But actually, who is it who's there as the guiding hand, who's helping retailers understand what is the best way to implement those payment methods to be able to reach those customers? So there is another thing to think about when we do this and when we kind of think about this stuff. So it's okay to talk about having the right payment methods, but I guess the challenge has been for a number of years is that the way to market to do that was always to implement a direct integration with the payment method itself. And what that did over a number of years, that created significant challenges, because it meant for you, the retailer, you had multiple integrations that you had not only had to kind of implement, but you also had to manage ongoing. You had multiple contracts, you had multiple SLAs, and you were probably being beaten daily by your finance teams, because what was actually happening was that they couldn't reconcile those different payment methods because everything had its own file format, everyone settled differently, and I guess the strain that was put on the finance team was quite significant. So the view that we kind of share as a payment provider is that actually, if retailers have got to do that, that's a really old-fashioned way of working. The role of the PSP really should be more about ensuring that the PSP does all of the hard work. So what the slide is there to really show you is that a good payment provider will ensure that all of the relevant payment methods are integrated on the platform so that they become configurable. So they're not separate integrations for the retailer. But more importantly, what the role of the PSP should be that advisory. So the PSP should be about giving you, the retailer, guidance so that you understand what the right payment methods are as you venture into new countries, and making sure that we help you switch those payment methods on. And that's an important point. It's switch on, not integrate. So you switch those payment methods on and you optimize those payments on your checkout. And that's kind of us, I guess, really, Declan, in terms of what we think.
No, I think that's great. And for me, always really insightful to understand the differences there in terms of those payment methods that have been adopted across, even just directly within Europe here. I mean, this diagram, I think, wraps it up quite nicely when you start to think on more a global scale. But I guess my initial response to that would be, which is great to see it, but there's also a lot of emerging technology, a lot of emerging payment methods that aren't necessarily just directly specific to markets, but are more cross-border than that. And so what we've got here is, I guess, a few different categories of payment methods that we believe to be growing in popularity. We're seeing it a lot more adopted within Europe. So I guess, from an outside point of view, how are payment gateways like Adyen then keeping up with these trends? How are you constantly integrating this type of technology into your core stack?
I mean, it's a good question, and I guess there's a couple of points here, right, that are really important to us. So the ability to remain agile as a PSP is as important, and I guess we would probably argue more important than the retailer remaining agile, because fundamentally, if we're not agile in our ability to kind of innovate and grow and develop, then it's very difficult for the retailer to do that. You're absolutely right. There are thousands of payment methods out there. What we have to do as the PSP is make sure that we are aware of what are the methods that are actually going to make a difference on your checkout. And we do that in a lot of ways. We do that by ensuring that we kind of think globally at a local level. So, we have multiple offices across the globe. We have direct relationships with all of these things that you can see on here. So Klarna, Divido, Amazon, we work directly with those businesses to ensure that we can integrate those methods onto our checkout so that the customer really doesn't have to do that. But we also need to make sure that from the retailer's perspective is that we stay kind of ahead of the curve. And yes, you're absolutely right. You've got things like Klarna and Divido and Amazon Pay that are on here. But there's an interesting one in there, which is open banking. And open banking, I guess, is the new kid on the block in terms of payment, right? So it's been made possible by some of the releases and the opportunities that PSD2 has delivered. So I guess for us, it's always about we as the PSP, we as the payment service provider, I guess, we've got to make sure that we are the ones who are advising the businesses on what matters. We are the ones who are bringing the opportunities to you and making sure that they're already embedded into the technical solutions, so that actually what you don't do is make your business overly complicated. And we have to do that in a commercial way. We have to be very commercially minded to ensure that these when there's a payment method that's valid, we believe, is that you get it in a commercial way that allows your business to grow.
And I think that the other thing that's interesting about this slide here is, not only do you have to consider the markets, I think, that you're starting to target and grow into, you also have to consider your business model. You have to consider the audience as well. So for example, spread finance I think is a particularly interesting one at the moment. We're now in an age where, we've seen for the first time customers are buying things like cars online, which, you go back maybe 5 years, was never really happening. So spread finance, in order to complement that type of business model, is really important. And when you think of trying to get finance as well, I mean, that's usually quite a tedious process. And trying to make that as frictionless as possible during the checkout process online, because as we all know, we want to start and finish that process within a few minutes, even if you are buying something like a car online. So it's interesting to see how players like Divido are coming into the market and taking on that challenge and trying to put a solution together for retailers that are obviously looking to leverage that as part of their overall proposition. And then you could also look at mobile payments. I think Apple Pay at the moment is probably the best in class experience, maybe alongside Android Pay, when you talk about a mobile checkout. So the ability to scan your fingerprint or the ability to scan your face to take you all the way from the start to the finish of that process within a few seconds, I think is about as good as we can get it right now, and obviously very heavily adopted in the UK. And Amazon Pay is a very interesting one now that we're starting to see real traction now with a lot of the retailers that we work with, starting to use it alongside something like a PayPal. And as you said, open banking, probably one of those where I haven't got much first-hand experience with it, but from what I understand of it, I think is probably something that's very much one for the future as well. So
there is another point as well there, Declan, that's worth thinking about, is that today we focus, and we're talking about e-commerce, but realistically, the separation between true bricks and mortar retail and e-commerce is going at a rapid pace. So when we talk about payment methods, it is interesting because the ones that we've got on the screen right now, they were built to be, we'll exclude Apple Pay a little, but they were built to be e-commerce payments. I think what's going to be interesting is to understand how in the next 12, 18 months, that distinction collapses further. We already know Apple Pay is probably the preferred method that you use online because it is strong authentication. It does pervade all of the different retailers. You don't have to enter your details every time. And we do know that, from retail, its participation in retail transactions is growing rapidly. But we need to watch what happens with Klarna. What happens with Klarna? The ability to take split payments inside of a retail store, the ability to do a bank-to-bank transfer for a retailer in those bricks and mortar stores. So I think when we think about e-commerce, we always need to just bear in mind the fact that we're actually just talking commerce. It's just a unified experience. And so when today we talk about internationalization and how you grow your brand, but at the back of the mind that, you know, it's always important to bear in mind that you need to bring consistency to the customer journey and the customer experience. And payments are a significant part of that, and that ability to have that complementary payment between on and offline. Retailers all the time talk about, you know, we have a real challenge where we have an online presence and then we have retail stores and we can't do refunds in store. How do things like that work? It's how you address all of those challenges I think are important.
No, of course. Right, so maybe this then steps back a little bit in terms of looking at some of the basics that I think sometimes can often be missed. We've seen it firsthand before. I think a lot of what we're talking about here is great, but it will only really work and get the kind of cut through I think that we'd all hope for if the checkout experience it kind of is fundamentally built in a way that means that we can just layer on top of it. So this is just a few examples here, I think, of quick wins and sensible things that should be considered when reviewing your overall checkout process. First and foremost is don't clutter the checkout experience with too many payment methods. So it's great now, I think, that we can understand that there's various different payment methods being used and adopted all across just Europe as an example market that we're using. But if you start rolling out all these new payment methods, you're potentially going to expose yourself to cluttering that experience and overwhelming customers. So it's really key to understand that if you can focus on creating an experience which does feel quite localized and bespoke for each market and just delivering the relevant payment methods instead of just activating those, that's where we would see the optimum type of implementation of something like this, the strategies and techniques that we've been talking about. And
you might just, as a thought, you know, also for those things, it's worth thinking about how you do that dynamically as well. So if, you know, things like Klarna or open banking, right? Are they really worth putting into a basket that's got a small value?
Exactly. Yeah.
Or how do you control it? If you know, if you want to do one-click checkout through particular payment methods, how do you define dynamically to say actually at this basket level we don't want to show those payment methods because they're not the best experience, they're not the best value for the customer. So I think those are really good examples. Exactly to your point is how do you ensure you don't clutter those pages and you keep your pages clean, but you're relevant.
Absolutely, yeah. Having clear CTAs, next steps, being able to go back. I think, you know, again, these are quite obvious points, but, you know, sometimes overlooked. I think because of the available amount, the kind of sheer number of available payment methods that are there now, I think it's quite often that customers will kind of change their mind halfway through the process. So I think it's just really important to be able to give them the ability to go back and forward through the checkout process. And another thing that we see, and I think this is really important, is that, you know, if you're looking at introducing new payment methods, trying to avoid multiple redirects is really key on the basis that it can often lead to a bit of a conversion killer, to be honest. You know, it's critical, I suppose, you keep the experience consistent throughout, and it's only ever going to work if you feel like this is seamlessly embedded into the checkout. So instances whereby you're getting to the business end of the journey and you're trying to transact in a payment method that is your personal choice, but then you're directed away, another 3 clicks, you're back onto the site. We know for a fact that, you know, this funnel here is key, the checkout process. We know that cart abandonment is a key thing. So having multiple redirects is never going to help with that. And something maybe we're going to touch on again a little bit is security and privacy. I mean, that's always been a key thing when we're talking about online transactions. But, you know, right now we're about to enter into a new phase of security when we talk about online transactions with the likes of 3DS 2.0, which I think Colin will explain more about. But they're just, I guess, some real sensible things to consider, I think, when you're also looking at, you know, what wholesale changes do we want to make about the payment methods that we're using. Okay, so this is still a very interesting subject, I think, when we talk about some of the intricacies about trying to trade just purely within the EU. So we've got a slide here, I think, that really highlights some of those real life differences there. So we know as a fact that merchants must be registered for VAT in all the countries they sell in once they reach / exceed a specific revenue. I don't believe that that's news to too many retailers that are already starting to look at international expansion. Maybe where there is some news in this is that there is some large-scale discrepancies, though, between where those thresholds are. So, you know, we've got 4 examples here. The UK would be 70k, Germany's 100k, France 35k. And, you know, again, we all look at the EU as a single market, very easy for us to access. But you look at the difference between 2 bordering countries here, France and Germany, the difference between 35k and 100k is quite a considerable difference there. It's way over double the difference. So I think it's really important to put a spotlight on the fact that these are the kind of things you also need to consider in the background to make sure that not only you're offering a good experience, but you're also protecting yourself when it comes to legalities than when you're trading internationally. So what's great, I suppose, with us is that we have a wealth of partners around us that are able to help with that. So taxmen.eu, for example, is one whereby if you're looking to understand it a little bit better and you're trying to get yourself set up with the right VAT accounts across Europe in the markets that you operate in, there's definitely there's resources out there that will certainly help you with that. And electronic invoicing regulations is a new one that's also very much relevant for right now. Businesses will often outsource VAT to a third party and manage invoicing themselves. And multiple VAT zones need to be configured to specific organisations that look after invoicing. And what we know is fact from our own experience is that in January this year, merchants need to be able to provide all invoicing details electronically in the Italian market, you know, and that's a very specific thing there, but it's probably going to be rolled out more globally. So these are the kind of trends that I think are really worth considering alongside as like almost a parallel thought process when we're looking at the payment methods. So Colin, I think this is probably one where I think you've got the most experience in, and I think this is something that I think a lot of people on the call are aware of. There's been a bit of a buzz over the last year, but I think from my point of view, what's really interesting as well is not only acknowledging, I suppose, the significance of this, but it's also acknowledging what are the actual differences and what are the opportunities that will come alongside it.
Yeah. So I think PSD2 is, you know, very generally, it's quite an interesting subject, really. So. And, you know, we were talking just before we kind of came online to say it'd be great if we had the ability to get everyone to vote to say, yes, I knew this, and no, I didn't know that. I guess generally my broad takeaway is that it's an area that's still quite heavily misunderstood in the market. And that's probably the fault of kind of payment service providers more generally, really, in that, you know, if technically they're not ready themselves, it's probably not a subject matter that they want to necessarily talk about, and that leaves kind of retailers kind of on the hook and a little bit in the dark, I guess. But very broadly, just kind of for the benefit of everyone on the call, so the Payment Service Directive fundamentally made or has 2 significant impacts if you're an e-commerce retailer. So the first one is the one that we've already discussed, in that, you know, it allows banks to open up their APIs, which then gives rise to PSPs being able to offer open banking as a payment method. And, you know, we can happily after this share more information with you about that. The other bit in terms of kind of the Payment Service Directive, which we wanted to talk about, which is really important, is just making sure everyone understands what's kind of happening with 3D Secure. So very broadly today, you know, retailers tend to opt out of 3DS, what we call 3DS1, because it's a bit of a conversion killer. Static password and the inability to kind of remember that static password and optimize that redirect on your checkout means that, you know, the risk of fraud is more bearable and the risk of conversion dropout. So retailers choose not to use it. But precisely because it was seen to be not mobile optimized and kind of customer traffic had moved away from kind of desktop through to mobile device, which was not what 3DS1 was designed to do, then, you know, the schemes did want to improve, and that's what the purpose of 3DS2 is. 3DS2 fundamentally has 2 purposes. Purpose 1 is to make sure that it is mobile optimized and there are more seamless, more effective ways to authenticate customers as part of a transaction. So we talk about things like, you know, biometric testing like thumbprint or facial recognition, but also one-time passwords. So simplified ways that customers are able to prove they are who they are or securely authenticate as part of a transaction. The other bit that I think is really important as part of 3DS2 is it also gives the payment provider the opportunity to pass more information to the card issuer as part of the transaction to make a more informed decision. And that really has two impacts. One, it means that they can aim to be more passive in the authentication. So if they know that you're coming in from kind of an IP address that you're used to on the website that you normally shop on, and that you've authenticated once through maybe thumbprint login, then there's more opportunity for them to passively authenticate. But the second piece is the more information you can give about the person making the purchase, the greater the likelihood that you're going to get an authorization. The stark reality of all of this is that 3DS2 is coming, and it'll be here on September the 14th. And at that point, if you as the retailer are not passing what we class as kind of securely authenticated transactions, which in reality means you've either got to be passing a transaction that's authenticated under the script of either 3DS2 or 3DS 1.2, then the risk that you do not want to bear is that the issuer chooses to decline those transactions. Because the issuers have been told from that date, then they must accept secure authenticated transactions. The risk of you using 3DS 1.2 is it relies on that static password, and then you go back to that risk of actually just killing your conversion at your checkout. And as I say, Dick, we're more than happy to kind of chat to anybody offline in terms of what 3DS2 means, but it is there and it's very clear, and you know the clock is ticking to some degree.
Absolutely. So just conscious of time now, because it looks like we just rolled past 1/2 the hour. I'm just going to, I think, maybe very quickly summarize these key takeaways. So I guess in terms of an overarching point here, I think that the key thing is to start thinking locally. You really have to start getting into the very specific details of each market you're looking to trade in, beyond just looking at things like, you know, culturally, what means a lot to them in regards to things like the language used and assets used and maybe the right product data. But it's also about the payment methods and when is best to serve those payment methods. So just once more, I think the key thing there though is that making sure that you serve those payment methods to the right audience. So a good example, like a real life example, would be looking at geo-targeting customers as well. So those that are visiting for the first time, they don't have the accounts there. You don't know, where their billing information is. You don't know where they're from. We can geo-target those customers, and we can serve the relevant payment methods based on their geographical location. It's key also to be reviewing the current capabilities of the payment gateway and the platform that you're on at the moment, in terms of seeing what kind of ceiling are you going to reach in terms of the payment methods that are already there. So, a lot of back office considerations to be made. Avoiding redirects is really, really important, as we discussed, because naturally it's going to lend itself to be a bit more of a conversion killer. You won't see the traction that you'd be looking for when you're trying to roll out a new payment method. And constantly look at the emergent trends that are happening at the moment. Test and optimize your payment gateway, the payment method strategy that you have. I think that's the thing. This changes and evolves so quickly. You can't be too static about the way that you work with this. So in essence, that's kind of packaging up, I think, everything that we wanted to get across. I think unfortunately due to the time now, we won't have the chance to do a Q&A session at the end. But look, if you want to engage with us, you want to find out more, there are questions, then myself and Colin will be accessible. Also, you feel free to use the Twitter hashtag winning eCom strategies, whereby we'll be online this afternoon to be able to respond to certain thoughts and feedback you want to share with us. But in the meantime, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. I hope you found that insightful. If there was anybody that dialed in late to this, rest assured we'll be uploading this onto our YouTube page, so you can watch this at maybe a more convenient time. But for now, I'd like to thank you, Colin, for joining us as well. I think that was great. I think, like I said, it was a really interesting subject for us that we constantly run up against, and I think there is this educational piece that I think we're starting to chip away at here. And stay tuned for our next installment coming in July. Thank you very much.